So we are looking at the biological levels of organization, and it's going to be really important as you go through not only this lesson, but the unit in general, and really the entire semester, thinking about where are we in terms of those biological levels in organization. In other words, how can we contextualize what we're looking at, or fitting the different pieces, the different topics that we're going to be looking at into the broad picture of biology. So I can look at the example of asking a question, where do you live? And how you answer it is really a matter of context. It's a matter of, in terms of the big picture, what is the best way to answer that question? So if you're moving into a new apartment and you have a bunch of boxes outside of your apartment building and somebody says, oh, hey, where do you live? You're probably going to answer with something more along the lines of maybe what room or what floor, so that given the context, given that you're already there, they're able to figure out what the correct answer is. Whereas if your teacher was to ask you, hey, where do you live? Like, I'm not from York, I don't know the area very well, and it would probably be in your best interest to not be too specific, to not be too vague. Maybe east side, west side, up by Stony Brook, down by whatever. I don't even know where Stony Brook is, but that's cool. If you're out traveling cross country and somebody says, where do you live? Again, it would be a little bit silly to be like, hey, I live in apartment 403B, or I live east side next to Stony Brook, because they don't know what you're talking about. So in context of where you are, Pennsylvania would obviously be the best answer. So really keeping context in mind is going to be important. And when we're looking at these biological levels of organization, I like to give the analogy of, this right here. We've got different pieces of bedroom furniture, and as you probably can figure out, these different pieces are going to come together in an assemblage to form the bedroom. And different rooms come together to form the house. Different houses form neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods make a town. Towns, cities come together to make the state. Different states making up the country, and finally making up the whole world. And in the very same way, we're going to see different levels of biological organization, atoms coming together to form molecules, and so on. Don't pay too much attention to this picture because a few things are a little bit different than how I'm going to explain it, but that is all good. So let's go ahead and start at the very smallest units that we'll be looking at least over the course of the year, which would be the subatomic particles, the proton, neutrons, electrons, and wait, no, that's wrong. Okay, these guys are going to come together to form atoms, and when you have multiple atoms that come together, those are going to form molecules. Now in biology, what's really important is that these molecules are going to form huge molecules called macromolecules. Macro meaning big. So micro is small, macro is big, think Big Mac. So a bunch of molecules that assemble in big long chains are going to make your really big macromolecules. We can look at it like this, either top down or bottom up. So macromolecules are made of molecules, are made of atoms, are made of subatomic particles, or vice versa, that the subatomic particles are going to come together to form the atoms, which are the smallest unit of matter, that is still being able to retain the properties of that matter. And those atoms are going to come together in different ways to form molecules via these covalent bonds, which we're going to talk about later on in the semester. And those molecules are then going to bond together to form even larger molecules, or the macromolecules. And this is all within the domain of molecular biology, which really looks at how all of these pieces fit in the broader context of biological organization, and like how different living systems are going to rely on them. Okay, so once we've studied molecular bio, we can take a look at what is called cellular biology. And cellular biology is just looking a little bit bigger. Macromolecules are going to come together to form organelles. Now, not terribly as direct as what we've seen so far with, like, say, atoms to molecules, but whole bunch of macromolecules, and different molecules all assembling together are going to make organelles, and those different organelles work together to be able to form the cell. Okay. The cell is the basic unit of structure and function in living things. Any smaller and it's no longer considered alive. So really, like if I was to cut a person up into 100 trillion different pieces, which I wouldn't do because that's wrong, and I'd get arrested, but what I would be left with is little chunks that are each super microscopic, and each one of those little chunks would represent their own little cell, and that's what makes you up. And so cells come in two varieties, two different types of cells that we typically look at, and they're hugely different. The prokaryotic cells, they're very, very simple. We are not made of prokaryotic cells. We are made of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotes are much more complex. So I give the example of if I'm looking so far at building from, my bedroom furniture to the bedroom to the house and so forth. Organelles are like your different rooms, and cells are like your different homes. So when I'm looking at prokaryotes, I'm thinking a cottage. I've got a bedroom in one area, I've got the kitchenette in a different area, I've got the dining room table maybe set off to the side, but it's really all in one open, uncompartmentalized room with maybe a bathroom off to the side. That's representative of a prokaryotic cell. Very, very simple, very, very small, and not a whole bunch of different compartments. So whatever organelles there are just very basic, and they don't really separate out each of the different areas. When I'm looking at eukaryotes, they're far more complex. We're thinking a media room and, a game room and maybe two master suites, each with their own huge walk-in closet, whole 9 yards going out here. Because eukaryotic cells are really compartmentalized, and these different compartments are made up by the organelles themselves. So I can take a look over here is an example of an animal cell, and you can see that this huge area right here is separated out from maybe these areas over here and so forth. So in purple, you've got the one organelle, the nucleus. In blue, you've got the endoplasmic reticulum. None of this needs to be memorized right away. But big picture that you're thinking is prokes, really simple, euks, way more complex, and that complexity arises because of the fact that they have more complex organelles. So up until this point, we've now covered the chemical or molecular levels of organization, subatomic particles coming together to make atoms, coming together to make molecules and macromolecules. All of those assembling together to make cells, which can be a little bit broken down by their organelles depending on if they're prokaryotic or eukaryotic. So very simply put, we've got 6 levels of organization, with cells being the largest and the subatomic particles being the smallest. Now, for some organisms, that's it. There's nothing more complex about them. In unicellular, meaning one-celled organisms, you're looking at a single cell being completely independent of any other cells and living on its own. So amoeba and the bacteria, for example, are unicellular. One individual cell is one individual organism, and that's the end of it. And so these organisms are really, really teensy-weensy, microscopic. Not you. You are absolutely not microscopic. You are made of, as I've mentioned before, hundreds of trillions of cells. And you're not just a conglomeration of cells just kind of packed in together, but instead you're very organized. Even if, your notebooks, your bedrooms, etc. aren't, your body, it is. So the different cells are organized into tissues. These tissues are, things like muscles, things like nerve tissue. And those tissues are then going to work with each other in organs. And these organs are things like your heart, your liver, your spleen, etc. You're probably very familiar with at least the terms. So tissues arrange themselves into organs. These organs then work with other organs to complete a full function. For example, your digestive system, your stomach alone, which is just an organ, can't do all the things necessary to digest food. Your intestines alone cannot do it, but when you combine them and your esophagus, your mouth, etc., you have a complete system that's capable of performing a complete function. And finally, when all of those organ systems are taken as a whole, you end up with an organism. So we tend to think about the tissues and the organs and organ systems that you would find in mammals or in other higher animals, but keep in mind that other multicellular organisms, including fungi, including plants, are going to have that same kind of organization. So plant cells are going to arrange into different tissues. For example, we can have like the outer covering of leaves as one type of tissue, and each leaf can be its own organ. Each thing that does a function is considered an organ, and so it's kind of weird to think of plants as having organs, but you know, they do. Organ systems are things like the roots versus the shoots, meaning the part above ground and the part below, and all of it taken as a whole is representative of a single organism. So we've really built up from here. In fact, it was the molecular stuff is so small that we can't even portray it because PowerPoint doesn't let you write that small. And so we've got these molecular pieces and then the cellular pieces. And when we look at multicellular organisms, we're also going to have the organismal layers. In other words, the cells coming together to form tissues, organs, systems, and then organisms. And then finally, we can't forget the fact that organisms don't exist by themselves. They live with and interact with each other, with other organisms of other species, and with their environment. And that is all within the realm of what we call ecology. So ecology is the branch of biology that is looking at the interactions of these organisms, how, as I said, they're working with each other, with their environment, how they're exchanging materials. So when we look at ecological levels of organization, we're really looking at anything bigger than the organism itself. So organisms that are all of one species come together to form a single population. For example, I can look at the human population. Populations tend to be all the same species that do live in one area, that interact with each other, that exchange materials, exchange nutrients and energy and so on, and also that may compete with one another and breed together. All of those definitions encompass what makes up a population. What you should know at this point is really just populations are a bunch of organisms that are kind of the same-ish. When you start mixing in different populations, so in this example, you've got the worms, the ferns, I guess, and whatever kind of little froggies these are, that makes a community. So communities are just different species that are all in one area interacting together. And then when you throw in all the non-living stuff, that's going to comprise the ecosystem. Now I want to point out here that that non-living stuff, it's really tempting just to think water and rocks and sand, but don't forget environmental conditions, cloud coverage, rain, temperature, wind, salinity, if you're looking at ocean or bodies of water. All of that is going to be part of that non-living component that living things interact with. So the communities in an area, along with all of that non-living stuff, is going to make up your ecosystem, and all the ecosystems on Earth, in other words, all of the place that living things live, make up the biosphere. So finally, we can look at all of the levels of organization, top down, bottom up, doesn't matter. With the ecological mindset going, we can start with the biosphere, which is broken into a bunch of different ecosystems. Each ecosystem is the community of individuals that live in that area, along with the non-living components. The community is just a bunch of different populations. Populations are just a bunch of different individuals of the same species. In multicellular individuals or in multicellular organisms, they are going to be broken down. Oh, there's my mouse. There we go. From the organism, that is going to be broken into the organ systems. Each organ system is made up of many organs that work together to produce a function, and each organ is made up of a whole bunch of tissues that, again, work together to do a particular job. So all of that is in the realm of the organismal level, and then we can get into the cellular level. So tissues here made up of a whole bunch of different cells. Cells are made up of different organelles. Um, and keep in mind that how many organelles they are and how complex they are is dependent on what kind of cell we're looking at. And finally, we can look at the molecular level, very, very teensy tiny, with looking at the biggest of molecules. But now hopefully you understand that that's still really tiny, is the macromolecules. Each macromolecule is just a string of a whole bunch of molecules put together. Each molecule is a bunch of atoms that have been molecularly bound to each other, and each one of those is made out of a whole bunch of atoms. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I said subatomic particles there. We're all good. Anyway, a lot of information, and I'll repeat this over and over again. Don't stress about memorizing each of these right now, because we are going to spiral again and again and touch upon each of these. But if you're in a place right now that it is convenient for you to memorize them, and to know the definitions, it will definitely help you in the long run. So I hope this helped. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and hit the little bell, or I don't know what you're supposed to say at the end of YouTube videos. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and hit me up if you've got any questions. Thanks. Bye.